Good evening and welcome to Nikos RPG. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, the Game Master's Guide, and I hope you have a great game at your table, and that's exactly what I want to endeavor to help you to accomplish. Today, we're going to be talking about the search for the perfect game session. We're going to be looking at the various elements that make up the perfect game. We're going to talk about how they can be targeted and, in theory at least, can be achieved within the very narrow category that we're talking about. But I think you're going to find that as we get closer to the end of this video, we're going to get closer to that perfection, and then we will basically slide down the other side of the mountain, so to speak. So let's talk about that together. Before we get to that step, make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, hit all the buttons down below. And it doesn't matter which one. I just would like to. I'm trying to improve the channel every day. I'm trying to make better videos and to create more compelling content for everybody. And so if there's anything in particular you'd like to have me do a video on that I haven't yet, please give me a heads up on what that would be. Leave a comment in the comment section, or if you're on with me on Discord, feel free, and here on Twitch, make sure you do that as well through the chat channel chat box, because I'm constantly watching it, and anything that you put in, I try to immediately engage with. So let's get started, shall we? All right. So before we can talk about balance or talk about the perfection of a game, we need to talk about what that would look like. So a perfect game session would run on an absolutely consistent basis. It would run for exactly the right number of minutes or hours. It would carry the right amount of action, adventure, a lot of combat, the right amount of that, and the right amount of puzzle and interaction, and the optimal amount of con discussion or dialogue, or optimally what is considered to be standard role play. But there are so many other things that we can use as a balance. Maybe what we're talking about in centering a basis is that we want to have the right amount of the use of the skills that we want to pursue. We want to include the right amount of dialogue between the players so that there is harmony among them. There needs to be a right amount of equality in conversation and limelight, and so on. And so it's important to pick which of these centering bases you want to actually track, because the reality is it's like real life. There are too many variables, too many possible things that could come up for us to achieve them all. So it's important to choose which of those centering bases we want to use. And that could be a myriad of possibilities. Most commonly, of course, would be the right amount of combat, the right amount of puzzle work, the right amount of role play. In those three are not necessarily an equal balance, but an overall amount of activity within the game session. And that's even itself is hard to balance, because how much is the right amount? And that really comes down to the players you have with your group. And that is going to bring us back around to the session zero that we've talked about before. I've got a video on the subject of session zeros, and I even did for a while a session zero series that was suggestive of what you might have in your session zero. And unfortunately, it became untenable, because just like anything else, any amount that takes too much time is itself deleterious to the effect. So we're going to be talking about it in a bunch of different categories. And if I have not covered one you think that should have been, make sure you let me know in the comment section. I'll do what I can to endeavor to match that in future videos. All right. As I've mentioned before, the field of reference that you are going to be working with is going to be based on what your players have brought to the table. And this is important because your session zero, your first interaction with the players, should be one of far more listening for you as a game master and far more talking from the players, because you need to know what you are working with, what they are working with in terms of their capacities, desires, uh, uh, duties. That's too strong. Basically, to get an idea of what your players bring to the table, so that you know which fields are going to be the most often used when dealing with them, and to also ensure that you're providing them the kind of feedback that they are hoping to find. So, the way you would follow this would be to ask questions about things like, what matters to a play to you as a player. Are you interested in the absolute realism of the day-to-day interaction? Are you willing to shine that in favor of getting more direct description of the NPCs? Are you looking for things that tickle particular motives and motivations you have in playing the character that you're playing? These entire series of questions are included in the newly released Dungeons and Dragons DM's Guide. Now has a form that provides you with a pre-game checklist. It's fundamentally the equivalent of a session zero without calling it such, and it expects the players to provide input on a whole variety of things. And rather than have rather than have a piece of paper that gets what the players write down and doesn't really give their perspective, I'd much rather have it be a live session where you have this direct interaction and you take diligent notes and track the important pieces so that the players get to put in what they want to have in the game, because it's really important that what you're doing is fun, because that's really what this is all about. It's sometimes, especially with players that have more than 5 or 6 years in the game, or 10 years as a game master, they are very concerned with the nuances of the game, but they've gotten so familiar with the rules that they're no longer being the diligent note takers. And so it's if you notice my little symbols, I really like this framing, because these symbols do show the give and take of the situations that we're in. And sometimes it's easy to get information, and sometimes it's difficult, and it's like pulling teeth to get additional information. But you have to have this frame of reference. And it's important to, especially when you're in a case like me where I'm running 6, 8, 10 adventures a week, it's important to be able to keep the frame of reference, the field of reference, if you will, for the players in each session separate from another, so that you remember, oh yeah, this group really likes puzzles and really digs chewing on the meaty parts of the role play, whereas this other group is perhaps younger players more interested in the dynamics of the universe, and therefore tend to have a higher concentration of murder hobos and YOLOs and Leroy Jenkins that we've talked about before. And so they are wild men in comparison, but you want to provide them with an optimal play experience. So while you may downplay the actual puzzles that they work through, nonetheless you can still provide them information from the monsters and creatures that they defeat and the locations that they inevitably will loot through. Now, beyond just the essence of what they're wanting from the game and what they feel are their strengths, you also need to determine what the hunting ground is. And when I refer to hunting ground here, I'm not saying necessarily it has to do with the combat dynamic of what a hunter would search, but it actually is talking more about the idea that the environment meets the demands of their motive. So if they are far more involved with wanting to use army kind of army terms, in other words, to kill people and break things. The idea, therefore, is you would put them in an environment where the likelihood that their engagements will be martial in nature and they'll have monsters to kill, and perhaps less on the people they have to talk to, because it tends to be the situation where you have a lot of people that have this martial concept that they tend to fight first and ask questions later, and that's not necessarily helpful in the terms of NPCs that they need to interact with. So choose a hunting ground, choose a mechanistic play area that suits that. So if they're big on puzzles, put them into a place where there are mines and dungeons and such. Now, notice that I'm speaking of this as if you are guiding them. And while in one sense you are, nonetheless, they should be given the agency to decide where they go, and just ensure that the recommendations that you provide them through the NPCs that they will talk to will guide them in the direction that take them to those places that suit their purpose. Now, I know my sandbox GMs are probably cringing a bit and holding their head in their hands, going, "That's not what I would do. I would not. I can't stop my players from going where they want to because I'm not the boss of them. I'm not their nannies. I'm just a resource that takes care of determining what their actions are." And to that I say, that's not entirely true, because it's a game of fiction and it's a game of fantasy, and where they choose to go can also coincide with where you want them to be, without you having to push them, simply by making the area that you're wanting them to go hunting in seem far more appealing, and provide them with access to information that lets that be known. I mean, putting out a sign someplace that says open season on Dwarger, or the villains of a certain valley have been on the uptake. Maybe these incidental news reports and clues will guide them in the direction you want them to go. And again, that really means you need to know how they play, so that you can know how best to provide them that information, so that they put themselves on a course to have a good time, and you are able to manipulate the story in such a way that it suits what they're doing. Choosing a hunting ground also means that you're considering the balance of what they are encountering and what they can tolerate. And there are game masters out there that disparage the storyteller game master, or even the sandbox game master, because they feel that the agency is being taken from the players. But my suggestion is that when you are preparing to run a series of adventures, a campaign or a series or even a single shot, you need to have a pretty good understanding of how the players are going to engage with the story, because if they are going to run away from it or divert from it, you have to learn to adapt on your feet and adjust the outcome of where they're going so that it makes sense. Because as I keep saying, one of my mantras is make your stories make sense. Depends on you having feedback from the players, so that when they make decisions, they also align with what you are trying to portray for them. Also, this is important from the standpoint of what game system you're going to use, whether you're going to use a very crunchy, very sophisticated moment by moment engagement kind of a mechanism, or if you're going to be playing fast and loose and allowing the players to kind of adjust as they go along. I could put a shameless plug here about Nikos RPG, because it is a open system and fast play adjustments can be made on the fly. But what I'm referring to really in this case is, what do the players want in terms of sessions? can give you an example. I was at Board Game Paradise on an off day when I wasn't actually scheduled to run an event, but a couple of youngsters came in. I say youngsters; they could have been 30. These younger folks came in and said they'd love to learn about Dungeons and Dragons, but they don't have anybody that can teach them, and they don't know when the sessions are. Well, I could have drawn the line and said, well, I'm not going to run for that because I don't like Dungeons and Dragons. But if I establish that that is what the breakover point is for this group, that they want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I'm certainly going to accommodate them, because it doesn't matter. I know this is a super secret reality that most game masters are at least tangentially aware, and most often will hide this from their players. But it doesn't matter which game system you use, they're all role play. I'm just saying. So therefore, when you determine what the mechanics are, what you're really determining is what their toleration is for character injury, character loss of consciousness, character um, free will and agency, and character profitability and advancement. They want to know all those things, and if you can accommodate, you want to basically gather this information so that when you need a direction change, you can utilize the very mechanics that they are playing with to drive them to make those decisions make sense. And it's also important to know what their objectives are. And again, session zero does this really well when you work with the players in determining how they got into the story, what they are wanting to do in the period of time that they're playing. Some players flat out don't care about a campaign story. They just want to have the checkbox and the tick box marked off and the right amount of experience points earned and the whatever doohickeys they have in their own minds that they want to get their hands on. And so by getting a hold on this information, it's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it's useful for you as a storyteller to give them elements of what they're looking for as substantive advancement perspective, and also will reward them for following the elements of the story that you wanted to bring into it. And it's also a matter of determining what their payoffs are. Well, when do these occur? In Dungeons and Dragons, the biggest payoff, if you will, for the players, pardon me, is the experience points, and having that solid hold on their advancement. At least if you are a novice game master and a new storyteller, it's helpful to be able to know that if they're aiming at 1,000 points, then you can scale it to be one monster who's worth 1,000 or 10 monsters that are worth 100. And by having these kind of moderators in your mind when you're playing the adventure, you can therefore control and guide that advancement as a form of balancing. You can balance their speed of advance by lowering the experience points that they are awarded, and that generally means you have less conflict. But it really is all a matter of how you as a game master wish to address the elephant in the room called player advancement. Okay, and additionally, the session zero's element and the very way of balancing is to decide what your limits are for what you will or won't allow, and what the player's focus or intent is on doing them. For example, I've related the story before about a game master who was a religious leader. He had a very dark intent for what he wanted to accomplish, and he didn't care what that did to the other players in the game. And in particular, he didn't care that there was a 10 and 12-year-old kid playing in the same campaign with him. And although he was 40 and was looking for this rather, I guess you'd almost say, depraved process, you would find yourself in a situation where the outcome of the player's desires finds itself in opposition to the outcome and objective of the other players in the game. And so you have to determine what you're going to be willing to do and how much you're willing to alter or sacrifice your story in order to get the outcomes that you want. And also, therefore, to hold the ground on those places. And with every role-playing game that I can think of, with the exception of Dungeons and Dragons 2024, you have that control. You have that right to establish what is and what isn't cool to be played at your table. And I'm sort of glad that I got out of traditional Dungeons and Dragons on a regular basis as early as I did, because I think this would have been a very Rubicon type of decision to make, because it's important to want to make your players comfortable and enjoy the game, but it's something else to give one person's joy higher priority over the other, the joy and appreciation of others. So yeah, it's important that you get an idea and have it firmly set in your mind on what your limits are going to be and what the intent of the game sessions should be. And usually this comes from, again, I sound like an old saw, the session zero. I find it fascinating. A session zero fundamentally need only be done once, but I've also found that a yearly readjustment is important, because your player numbers change, your players that are in the game change, and the players' motive, even within the same character year over year, can change. And so by keeping a steady hand on what's going on and keeping a steady hand on the teller, so to speak, you can hold on to all of that. Aha! There's Shaggy. Welcome back. Welcome back. Glad to have you back. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of the matter, but actually, in this case, the end of the matter is actually just the beginning. I've gone over the different varieties of balancing mechanisms that you can use to determine the scale, but I promised at the beginning we'd find a way to get to the perfect game. And that really does depend on the players you have at the table on an ongoing basis. This means, therefore, if you have a very fluid table, as you usually will have when you are playing at a professional facility, a game store, or a game pub or whatever, when you are playing with people that rank and change out a lot, then it's important to really focus on what the players at the table at this moment want to have. Shaggy, we're talking about the search for the perfect game session. And so if you've got some ideas on what that would look like, give me basically an outline of what you envision to be your perfect game session, and I'll try to walk through the process that I'm talking about in that specific. Because when I'm talking about it, I've got so many different alternatives over a 50-year gameplay cycle that I can argue for and against. I said again. It's a southern phraseology. But what makes a perfect game, for example, for me, is about 20% puzzle, about 20% physical interaction, which means skills checks and or combat, and about 20% actual player interaction through role play. And then the other 40%, I appreciate it when the drama of the long tail game is such that they spend time looking at what's happening to them individually in the context of what that might mean in the overall ramifications. The very process in Nikos RPG of the injunction means that the players from their inception are aware that they are the champions of the world, that it is their uh, opportunity and obligation to do what they can to progress the storyline because it's what is expected of them. And it doesn't mean they do every time. As a matter of fact, the entire fifth iteration was fundamentally just that, a group of players that determined that, I'm sorry, sixth iteration, they determined that they were not there to solve anybody else's problem. They weren't there to conclude a story that I was building, but instead to do whatever they wanted. I would argue that they were fundamentally acting as a sandbox adventuring group because they literally would talk to each other at the very first session and then decide what they were going to do whimsically, just literally choosing a random course and pursuing it. And therefore, I never knew as a game master what I would be adjudicating that week. So I had to be pretty nimble in order to make sense to the game, which, like I said, is my mantra. Okay, so Shaggy says a perfect succession involves an equivalence of world building and player interaction. Storytelling is incredibly important, but getting lost in your characters is easy. A good way I find to avoid this is to balance as evenly as possible with gameplay. In a breakdown of gameplay specifically, it's a good template to follow with your ratio of puzzles, skills checks, and a lot. Okay, great. I appreciate that, Shaggy. And in the hands of most game masters, this definition of a perfect session will be mystifying and almost impossible to accomplish because they don't. A game master is tasked with knowing so much about the rules and the manifestations of certain things and the likelihood of certain things happening that they don't even get a chance to do much world building. As a matter of fact, I would go as far as to say that most game masters prefer to peruse the open market on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week session basis, find a module or a book or something that has a story that they can overlay the play experience onto the players without them actually having to do the world building. I agree with you, Shag, that the idea of a system that includes world building is essential. And I would also argue that even if you are running a series of adventures from written documentation, you are fundamentally building out the world in your own terms so that other players will experience the world when you run the game through the decisions that you make and the rulings that you determine. And with all of that in play, the concept of balance becomes important. And I'm going to give another one of my super secret rules. It's actually in the newest DM's guide, which I found fascinating. But the predominant rule is the rule of 8. If you're using a D20 system, if you're using a 20-sided as your success failure mechanism, then the rule of 8 really does help to make that. And that is, if you look at the mathematics of a role-playing game, generally 10 is the median of almost all the numbers. So you're rolling against, if you're going to hit the side of a barn with your weapon, you need basically a 10. And most players, when they play a character of their own choosing, will play one that has a general +2 modifier. That's mainly because you have usually one attribute that does go up to the maximum modifier, which is +4, and then you'll have a scaled difference down from there. So the idea of how you can host what would be to most people a perfect adventure is to learn the mechanisms of dice for whichever system you're working on, so that you as a game master can on the fly modify the die rolls so it has the kind of outcome you're looking for. That is to say, if your players are combat related, you need to make sure that they hit a fair number of times that they roll, which means, for example, if you are looking for the average number to make it fairly competitive, you use 8 as the basis and then modify up from there with equipment, with opportunity, and with conditional numbers that allow the player's numbers to moderate down to ultimately needing an 8 or better on the dice. What that does is it makes the number fluctuate a healthy amount, but that you've already scaled the adventure to give a slight advantage to the players. It's like, imagine you're the house and you have built a casino machine that gives the player advantage because you want the players to walk away a little bit better than when they came in. Well, you'd make the roulette wheel pay the players when it hits green instead of the opposite. So that's a good question. When in practice, a perfect session is one that keeps the players asking when the next one starts. Exactly. When do we play again? Because I want to find out what happened with that last attack. Did I actually get the ogre, or is he still going to be after us? Yeah, exactly. This actually feeds into something that I found fascinating recently. I was doing some research for the Imagination Launchpad on the desire and the search for happiness. And I found it fascinating that, and I've done the experiment with with my players, where I've run a 2-year campaign. At the end of 2 years, I gave the players exactly the conclusion that they had said would be sufficient to retire their character. And 100% of the time, they wanted to continue, even though they'd already hit the sweet spot. They'd already said, I want to kill this many monsters, I want to reach a certain level, I want to have these attributes and these skills. Well, congratulations, you got all those things. The end. And they're like, what do you mean the end? My character is still alive and I'm not dead yet. And blah, blah, blah. In their mind, the story continues until it can't continue anymore, not because they wanted it to stop. And to me, that is a very telling thing, because that's ultimately what that comes down to, is that the human brain loves a challenge, loves a puzzle, loves a difficulty that needs to be overcome, and they love working through the endeavors to make that happen. But they don't get an additional bump. They don't get anything when they complete it. There's no payoff reward, only a pursuit award. And therefore, it became important that in the world of Nikos, there isn't anything to stop your adventuring. There's no numeric cap where you are impervious. There's no structure at which we have to stop. And by giving the game an infinite growth path, we provide them with the mechanisms for an ongoing story, so that the only thing that can stop it is when the game master says the game is over, or just in order to create a new one to keep going, or a player can say, okay, I'm now tired of this character, I now want to retire it. And that generally is somewhere between 2 and 3 years. That's from my experience. And so what's really fun is that the Nikos saga, the full lengthy campaign of the world of Nikos, is 7 years in length, which means that it's never going to be very, very, very few times where you have a player who has a dogged determination to play the same character from the beginning to the end of an arc. As a matter of fact, in the actual world, in the face of the Nikos RPG mechanism, there have only been less than a handful of characters that have accomplished it. Most of them go for about 2 to 3 years, and then they are ready to retire that character and switch, because 2 years playing the same game week over week over week can be daunting. And so even though your advancement is continuous, even, for example, it takes, if you cycle through one specific skill every week, it would take you a whole year, even if you start with a moderately high number, you can't get to perfection without spending more than a year on that particular skill, and nobody would do that anyway. But which means that the person is always waiting for the next bump of advancement. What Nyker's RPG does better than the others is that it allows you as the player to have agency over what those numbers are and how they advance. And I'm glad you brought up also, Shaggy, the concept of balance, because the error there is that we don't really want balance. We want the opportunity to have the possibility of achieving some modicum of balance. And the only thing we don't like is blowouts either way. We don't like to lose because of a random set of serious, dice rolls, and we don't like to win on a randomly serious set of dice rolls. So the element of all of this that makes the game super appealing and makes you consider it to be a perfection is the right amount of, I would say, constructive dissatisfaction. In other words, you have enough dynamically bad rolls that you feel like the dice were not in your favor or dice weren't cheating for you, and the right amount of serendipity and happenstance so that you feel like it was not a pushover, and there was enough outright failure to make you feel like there's things that you can get better at and can improve on to reduce that failure. And that's ultimately what all games try to do, even Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I haven't, this part of it haven't quite read for myself in the new 2024 material, is that they are downplaying the actual exploration of a character. They're in Nyker's RPG, it's definitely cited out that a player's will is taken into account with that kind of situation, because the player may choose to spend an extended time in suffering in order to gain some benefit to keep going. Or they may have a decision that they just say, well, this is too painful, I don't want to continue. But ultimately, it's down to the player's choice to determine whether the end of a character's arc is a demise, and almost never is it something they want to do. And so having opportunities to do, pardon me, with some gas or heartburn or something, but the reality is that the players want to feel the stress of the potential of failure, and even embrace at times the bad luck factor of any random number generation mechanism, but they don't want to feel like they don't have any agency. And so if you can balance those, that's really what you have to balance, is the expectation versus the reality of the game session. And if you can balance those, you can make the game what players are looking to engage with and making it make sense. So as we're nearing the end of the time that I have to work with, we're actually in the end of the matter already. What kind of recommendations would you like me to provide that might be able to help you get to perfection in your games group? I've been doing this for 50 years, and I would say about 100% of the time, with serious confidence, my players feel like the session was a success every time we play. And to the point where players are constantly asking me to add extra episodes. So that this is a point I need to mention. There has been a change in our game sequence on our Patreon games. So the people in my Patreon game are those that are supporting it at least at the $20 value, and they get free any number of game sessions that I can run over the weekend. And currently I have 2 in operation, so I have a gap for a third. We are working and endeavoring to get one of them to be a live stream recorded episode, which will be here on Twitch and will reside only on Twitch, and we will endeavor to save enough pieces from that to keep people playing week over week. But the the reality is currently our groups are Friday night at 9 p.m., which seems like a late time to start. But if you know me, I don't keep I don't keep normal hours, as I am predominantly a game master and secondarily a ghostwriter and novelist. Uh, I tend to work odd hours all the time. So it's 9 p.m. on Friday nights, and that's Pacific time, and then at 1 p.m. Pacific on Sundays. That means right now I currently have all of Saturday available. So if we can get enough people interested in the game from Twitch and or YouTube, I'd be willing to create a new uh, social media game. As a matter of fact, I made a couple of attempts at those, and so if you are interested in playing an RPG using the Nikos mechanism right from the community of your house, look into Roleplay Roulette. You can do a search for that within my channel. There's several startup episodes for Roleplay Roulette sessions there, and of course I'm constantly running games of Roleplay Roulette whenever I can draw enough people together. Generally, the requirement is at least 3 players, so realize that we'll want to front load that. So if you are interested at all in being a part of the Nikos Roleplay Roulette mechanism and playing a roleplay game in a system you haven't yet discovered, check out nikosrpg.com and get your hands on the free-to-play quick start rules that are available at the Play Now page of the website, and also download for yourself the persona sheet. Oh, that's a good one. Attention retention. That's good. Long-term combat. Oh, long-form combat and initiative roles, as well as logistical non-combat situation. Thanks for. Oh, that's a great one. That's a great one. I actually have a couple of videos on that in particular, talking about the different combat systems, and I'll endeavor, Shaggy, to get you that information, and we will do a video on that in particular, the way you've worded it, to talk about how do you handle the large-scale combats. I have talked about it before, but there are some philosophical reasons why I haven't done directly addressing game systems, but I will definitely do that. It's a really good idea, so I will do that, and I will also couch one on the merits of the Nikos mechanism, because it blurs the line between, say, a Warhammer-esque combat style and a role-play-esque fighting style, so that you get a healthy mingling of the two kinds of feelings to the sessions, so that the combat can be extended, but it doesn't have to be overlong. It's not bloated by the hit point limitations and the massive bubble of life points that most games use. So that's a really good one. In terms of the second half, boring stuff, interestingly, Nikos RPG directly handles that. And so it turns literally the very concept of political discourse and economic exchange on their ears, so much so that some of my players actually enjoy going into town to go to the market and haggle, because the haggling conflict is as entertaining and enjoyable and surprising as a combat fight would be. And arguably, it's also useful for getting the players to shovel through the mountains of gold that adventuring generally creates. So I will definitely do that for you, Shaggy. So feel free to continue to add comments here and in the comment section on the YouTube channel when this video is uploaded there a little bit later tonight. I want to thank you for being here for the entire show, Shag. And if you have any particular information, if you're interested in playing, check out the patreon.com/Nikos. and join us there. That way you get access to our full catalog of game rooms and such, so you can be involved with us in our live games online through Discord. And this has been Nyko's RPG for this week. This is the last night show. Tomorrow we do have a game session, which, of course, you can become a member of by participating with us at patreon.com. And other than that, I will see you tomorrow morning for the last show of the week. And I will try, Shaggy, I don't know that I can get it done this week, but I will try to get that event scheduled that you're talking about, dealing with the keeping the player's attention in the long form non-combat situations, because certainly there are parts of the story that you want to get told, but if it isn't enjoyable to the players, then it just becomes a wall of a TLDR fundamentally, because they don't have the attention span. And I'll show you how we can regain that and maintain that for your group going forward. Again, thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin, the Game Master's Guide, and I will see you next time.